Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Dr. Marion Nestle, who is Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University. She is also visiting Professor of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell. Her research and writing examine scientific and socioeconomic influences on food choice and its consequences, emphasizing the role of food industry marketing. She is the author of 6 prize-winning books. She has received many awards and honors for her excellent teaching, research, and writing. Welcome, Marion.
I'm glad to be here.
So I want to start with something fundamental. What's the difference between food and nutrition?
Nutrition is about nutrients, the components of food that are required for life. We need certain vitamins, minerals, organic compounds, and energy in order to live, and nutrition is the science of all of that. Food is the source of nutrients, and so nutrition necessarily has to deal with food, diets, and health. And these days, many other aspects, but mostly diet and health.
Yeah. So in general, when we think about food, that is something that we eat, that the GI system converts that into calories. So in that context, any nutrition that is injected directly to the bloodstream, you wouldn't call that food then, right?
Oh, and once it's in the body, it's nutrients.
Yeah.
Or metabolites. And the whole process of digestion is set up to take food, no matter what kind of food it is, no matter how complicated and how many different components it contains, and turn it into usable metabolites that will build our own structures. So it takes the structure of carrots or pork or pigs and turns pigs and carrots into us.
Right. And so how have our ideas around necessary nutrition changed over time? What did we think maybe 20, 30 years ago? And what is our current understanding in terms of what is required in terms of nutrition?
Well, actually, nutritional requirements have been known since the mid 20th century, when the last of the vitamins were identified. But the big change has been from identifying nutrients that were required for life and prevention of nutritional deficiency diseases to diseases of overconsumption of food. That shift occurred after the Second World War, and 20 or 30 years ago, obesity became a big problem as people were eating more energy than they required.
Right. Yeah. So overabundance of food seems to have led to obesity. I don't know the latest statistics, but in the US, nearly 1/3 of the population could be considered obese based on the BMI characteristics.
Yes, and 2/3 are considered overweight.
Okay. So 1/3 is considered obese and the remaining 2/3 is considered overweight?
No.
No.
2/3
Two-thirds
altogether.
of
Two-thirds are
total.
overweight. Obesity
Okay.
is overweight.
Okay. Yeah, so there is a difference in the BMI scale between just overweight and obese.
Yeah, it's divided up. The BMI is body mass index is a useful scale. It's not totally precise. For looking at the proportion of the weight is in proportion to height.
Yeah.
And there's an arbitrary cutoff of 25 for overweight and 30 for obesity. And these are somewhat arbitrary, but it's still, I think, a useful way of looking at it.
Yeah. And I would
Because
imagine, go ahead.
it has to do with risk. The risk of chronic diseases increases with increasing BMI.
Right, right. And I would imagine it is definitely different for different ethnicities and different countries and so on, right?
Well, I think it depends on a lot of social characteristics in the population. For example, among Asian populations, the risk of chronic disease occurs at body weights or BMIs that are much lower than are in the United States.
Yeah.
And whether this is genetic or whether this is behavioral is something that hasn't been sorted out yet.
Yeah. So, what do you think are the major causes of this? I guess it has been rising for, like you say, after the Second World War, and it seemed to have almost exponentially going up now. What do you think are the primary causes of increase in obesity in the U.S.?
Oh, it's very simple. People are eating more.
Yeah.
Really, it's as simple as that. And obesity rose after the Second World War, but it rose very slowly.
Yeah.
The really sharp increase occurred between 1980 and 2000. When the number of calories in the food supply increased by about 800 a day, and people began eating about 300 or 400 or 500 calories more a day than they had prior to the
Yeah.
1980s. And there are a number of factors that I think were responsible for that. One was that food in the United States was greatly overproduced, and
Yeah.
the number of calories in the food supply rose enormously. Companies had to sell that. And they invented an enormous number of marketing techniques that encouraged people to eat more. And since the most profitable foods are often the least healthy or the
Yeah.
most caloric, there was a big push to increase portion sizes and to find ways to get people to eat more than they had been before, and people did.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to account for the roughly 20-pound weight gain that occurred on average during that period, for the number of calories that people were eating more of.
Right. Yeah. So the required calorie intake for a male is it approximately 2,500 per day?
Oh, that's a very rough figure.
Yeah.
It may be a bit higher than that, but the average figure that is used for the population as a whole is 2,000 calories a day, and the American food supply provides twice that.
Twice that. So we are
Twice that.
consuming per capita basis about 4,000 calories
No,
approximate. Yeah.
no, there are 4,000 calories available in the food supply.
Uh,
Some of those calories will be wasted, and not all of them will be consumed.
yeah.
But the idea that there is twice as much food available as the population actually needs
Right.
um,
Right.
puts enormous pressure on the food industry to sell more food.
Right. So what is actually consumed on a per capita basis, very approximately?
Well, it depends on who you
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah.
The Department of Agriculture says that about 1/3 of those calories are wasted, so that brings it down to an average of about 2,500 calories a day. But it varies enormously.
Yeah, yeah. And there, I guess there isn't very clear data on, if you think about this from a physics perspective, calories in and calories out, there are multiple ways to get the calories out, maybe physical activity, exercise. But a lot of the calorie consumption is really endemic, isn't it? 20% of the calories consumed in the brain. And so, what is your understanding now? How much of the calories can be taken out by mere exercising and physical activity?
Well, most of the calories are consumed by what's called basal metabolic rate.
Yeah,
I mean, that is the general cost of keeping your heart beating and your brain functioning and blood flowing and so forth, kidney function, liver function, all of those. That's where most of the calories go. Unless people are enormously physically active, the average person is using 80% of the calories for housekeeping functions, and that's why it's so difficult to lose weight
yeah.
through physical activity. A rule of thumb is that it takes 100, it's only 100 calories to walk or run a mile,
Wow, yeah.
on average. So that means if you overeat 400 or 500 calories a day, you need to walk or run 5 miles in order to work that off. Most people don't do that.
Right. So the focus really has to be, if you want to get a control over obesity, the focus really has to be at the intake of
Yeah,
calories. Right?
you
Yeah.
have to eat less. The easiest way to lose weight is just to eat less.
Eat less. Yeah. And obesity obviously leads to many metabolic syndrome diseases like hypertension, type 2 diabetes. I can't quite remember. There was some hypothesis. It was used to be called famine hypothesis, that early humans obviously had very little to eat, so the system is really very finely tuned to expect very little calories, and it's very efficiently designed. And when you start to give it more calories that it can really process, it all gets into the problem of obesity, right?
Well, I think that's a fair way of putting it. We're set up so that it's very difficult to starve us to death.
Yeah,
There are all kinds of metabolic compensations that occur when people don't have enough to eat. And the body is set up to be hungry. Hunger is a very unpleasant sensation, and people want to do something about it when they feel hungry. And it's very easy to overeat, especially easy to overeat what are called ultra processed products, which
yeah,
are designed to be extremely tasty, are very high in calories. Uh, and there's something about those kinds of foods, junk foods was the way what they used to be called.
yeah.
There's something about eating junk foods that really encourages people to eat a lot of them and add calories and put on weight.
Right,
So if you're trying to lose weight, the first thing to do is to stop drinking sugary beverages. And the second thing to do is to stop eating as many ultra processed foods.
right. What do we know from an evolutionary perspective? At least, early on, maybe now, 50,000 years of consumption of meat, fruits, nuts that is easily accessible for humans. And then we had agriculture kind of set off maybe 10,000 years ago that fundamentally changed the dietary habits. What are the implications of those types of things? Is the system really designed to consume agriculture-based products?
Well, it may or may not be, but that's what we have.
Right.
And certainly longevity is much greater now than it was. Uh, from the archaeological evidence, it's pretty obvious that people 10,000 years ago weren't living nearly as long as people are living now. So, whatever it is we're doing, we're not doing terrible things.
Yeah.
But we could eat better, and we could be healthier, and we could avoid chronic diseases to the extent that we now have them if we ate real foods and not processed foods, and didn't eat quite as much as a lot of people are eating. It's very, very difficult to cut down on the amount that you're eating because we're used to eating a lot and there's a lot of terrific food around.
Right. Yeah. And on your blog, you mentioned a book. It's entitled "Eat Like the Animals," and one of the things that came out of this book is that the body is requiring certain level of proteins, and you're basically sugarcoating the protein to get it into the system, and that's how we are getting excess carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis and it's a very well written book. I'm not sure I believe it
Yeah.
because if you just eat food, you're going to get enough protein. People who eat enough calories get enough protein. Protein is absolutely not an issue in
Hmm.
American diets. If anything, I mean, most people consume twice the protein they need. And it's only under conditions of great food deprivation that protein becomes an issue.
Yeah. And we are pretty sure now that carbohydrates is the issue, right? Carbohydrates.
Oh, I don't think so.
No.
Oh, I
Okay.
would disagree with that.
Okay. Okay.
I think calories are the issue.
Calories are the issue. So,
Calories are the issue. Doesn't matter where the calories come from.
hmm, okay. Um, so I was under the
I
misimpression
mean,
that. Yeah.
no,
Go ahead.
let me just stop. The two issues are processing and
Yeah.
calorie. For obesity, the issues are calories and processing.
Yeah.
So if you're eating processed carbohydrates, that goes under the heading of processing, and you want to avoid them to the extent possible because you take in too many calories and you're encouraged to eat more than you need. But obesity is about calories. I've yet to see evidence that convinces me of anything else.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense from a physics perspective for sure. Calories in is calories in, and it has to go somewhere. And so what you're saying, Marion, then is if you eat natural stuff, it doesn't really matter if it's grains, carbohydrates, protein, and if you eat just enough from a calorie intake perspective, you would be doing good.
You'll be solving a lot of problems.
Yeah.
I mean, that would really take care of a lot of problems. And to the extent that the foods are relatively unprocessed,
Yeah.
um, they are usually satisfying and they don't encourage people to overeat. I mean, nobody overeats salads. Lots of
Yeah.
people, lots of people overeat hamburgers. Or drink too much sugary beverages and so forth. I mean, we're set up to respond to these very highly processed products in a way that encourages us to take in too many calories.
Right.
And I don't think it matters whether it's fat or carbohydrate. Protein is pretty much the same no matter what the fat and carbohydrate are. So the big variation is in fat and carbohydrate. The healthiest populations in the world have been Mediterraneans who eat a very high proportion of calories from fat, and Asians who eat a very high proportion of calories from carbohydrate.
Yeah.
That's where the greatest longevity has been in those traditional diets. So I don't think it matters.
Yeah. So, from a policy perspective, do we have it right in terms of the food pyramid and all of that that's out there?
Well, the food pyramid isn't being used anymore and hasn't been used for quite a
Uh,
number of years. The general dietary advice is to eat a lot of fruits, vegetables, and grains in relatively unprocessed form, and to avoid highly processed foods that are high in salt, sugar, and saturated fat. I mean, it's mostly talking about foods, not nutrients. The new edition of the dietary guidelines is underway, and they had a big meeting about it. And I was interested to and amused to hear that there will be very few changes from anything that's ever been said before. And in fact, dietary advice is so simple that the journalist Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I can't say it better than that.
Right, right. Yeah, it's the implementation of that simple idea that is often difficult for most people.
Precisely. That is precisely the problem.
Right, right. And in the presence of, as you say, a wide variety of choices in front of us, maybe most of them,
Heavily and
yeah,
heavily marketed choices.
and heavily marketed, heavily processed, and processing obviously allows us to make food in mass quantities. So on a per calorie basis, it reduces the cost of production.
Yes.
Yeah, but on the back end, obviously, it has negative effects on health and other things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard to argue against cheap food because cheap food means that everybody will be able to afford the calories and the nutrients they need. But there are externalized costs
Yeah.
of cheap food that are borne by the population in other ways, in poor health and in tremendous damage to the environment. So there's a trade off between efficiency and health and efficiency and sustainability. And the COVID-19 pandemic has pointed out
Yeah.
those contradictions between efficiency and sustainability and health. And we're going to have to do something to resolve some of that and maybe lose a little efficiency and get more health and more sustainability.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. COVID-19, you have again on the blog observed some changes in lifestyle. Obviously, people cooking more at home, and on the negative side, maybe they're snacking more. So there are some behavioral changes that may not be tactical. It might be systemic as we go forward. And then we saw a lot of logistical issues in concentrated food manufacturing that led to some risks in the supply chain. So, what do you think we have learned from COVID-19, and what do you think? Which aspects of these changes do you think is going to be systematic and continuing even after the pandemic?
Well, the big systematic issue has to do with efficiency. The efficiency created two completely separate food systems in the United States, one for institutions and one for grocery stores.
Hmm.
And those were so far apart and so separate that it was impossible to shift from one to the other. When everybody had to go home and all the institutions closed, restaurants closed,
Yeah,
um, the food service closed everywhere, there was no easy way to shift from one food supply chain to the other. And the result was that vast amounts of food were destroyed at a time when people were unemployed, out of work, and needed food to be distributed. That food could not be put into the supply chain in order to feed people who needed it. I mean, that was such a graphic problem that I'm hoping that legislators will realize that nothing like that can ever be allowed to happen again.
hmm,
So that'll be a big change. I think what's happening with individual food consumption patterns depends very much on who the individuals are.
yeah.
Some people are cooking more, some people are baking, some people are growing food, some people are doing all kinds of things like that. Other people are just doing the best they can
Yeah.
under very, very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, so I would like to understand that the two distinct supply chains, one for institutions, one for grocery chains. Why do they exist as distinct supply chains?
Well, because the restaurants have to have, and food service has to have a steady supply of vast quantities of food
Hmm.
in order to make sure that they can produce whatever it is they're supposed to be producing when they produce it. And the volume is enormous, and they have had to work out with specific suppliers
Yeah,
who do nothing but supply institutions. And this means schools, restaurants, prisons, hospitals, any kind of institution where there's mass feeding. And so separate supply chains were set up for that because it was more efficient to do that, and they could keep the costs low. The supply chains for grocery stores are different, and they evolved separately. And what this showed was that there's very little overlap, and there was very little ability to go for a farmer. I mean, the meat industry was the place where this showed up the most, because meat packing plants, there's so few meat packing plants in the United States because of efficiency. They got bigger and more centralized. When there was no demand for the meat, the producers of animals killed their animals. And this was while people were going hungry. It was really quite shocking.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it seems to me that the cost per unit is what really differentiating the two supply chains, cost per unit and quantity. But the starting materials are the same, right? So I think what you may be suggesting from a policy perspective, maybe there's an opportunity to think about this as a single system.
Well, I think
And
it definitely needs to be a single system, and it needs to be a much more diversified uh, system in which there are opportunities for smaller regional producers to produce food and set up a distribution system that's more regional. To have these kinds of national systems. I mean, small meat producers have been complaining for decades that they have no ability to slaughter their animals. In particular, the producers who are trying to produce animals sustainably, grazing them, not feeding them hormones or antibiotics. And they have complained that they go to all this trouble to raise these animals under uh, the best possible and most humane conditions. And then they have to put them into a truck and drive them for hundreds of miles to a slaughterhouse because meat has to be slaughtered under USDA approved conditions. And there are not local slaughterhouses. So this showed what's wrong with that. There has to be local and regional food production if it's going to be more resilient. And efficiency is the opposite of resiliency. And so there has to be a less efficient food system if it's going to be more resilient. That's
yeah,
going to make food more expensive, and that's a problem.
it's going to make it more expensive. So, that has always been the argument. The argument against local production has always been one of cost and reduced efficiencies. But what is not in that equation is one of risk, right? So, in the case of uh, something like a pandemic or something else, where there's a shock to the system, when you have high rigidity in the supply chain, the way that we have set it up, is going to cause us trouble. That's what we have seen in this situation, I think.
Oh, I think that's a really good way of putting it. That risk was never in the equation. You're absolutely right. And yeah, I like that way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah. So to conclude this, Marion, so if you were to make one or suggest one policy change anywhere in the food and nutrition arena that could have a significant impact, whether it's obesity, healthcare, food safety, food availability, whatever it is, what would that be? What would be the policy change that you would consider to be most important?
I would divert support for concentrated and vertically integrated food production to more local and regional food production.
Okay. And so that is really increasing local production, regionalization. Yeah.
Mm. Re-regionalize the food supply.
Yeah. Yeah.
And something like that, and that would make it much more resilient. But as I said, what we saw in meat packing plants was so shocking. The other part of it is I think we have to pay people who are working in the food industry much better than they're being paid. The idea that the lowest paid workers in the food system were suddenly deemed essential, even though they didn't have sick leave or healthcare benefits, was also quite shocking to observe.
Right. Yeah. So again, from a policy perspective, I think what you're saying. So when you have centralized production, very rigid supply chains, there is a risk and a cost associated with it that is not in the equation. And so, if you want a more resilient system, perhaps you need to tax the unseen cost and risk in some fashion, and then divert that to areas that we know purely from a production perspective is going to be more costly to accomplish, right? So
I think so.
yeah. That sounds great. This has been good, Marion, and I really appreciate the time that you spend with me.
My
And
pleasure.
yeah, good luck with everything that you do.
Thank you too.
Thanks so much.